to choose for, a person that you're working with. And then after a few minutes, and I'm going to stop the video and actually, then we'll go through what the activities are for the week, which is a little bit different than the past several weeks. So, there's lots of therapies to learn about, and it can be sometimes overwhelming and possibly intimidating, not really knowing how to use those therapies. So the first thing that you really want to do is try to become as familiar as you can with as wide of a range of therapies that you can, so that you can best determine which ones are really that feel comfortable to you. There's a lot of overlap between some therapies, so that the actual direction that you take one can be more comfortable than another, but you're still doing the same thing. You're getting to the same place, and you're treating the same condition. I'll talk about what I do in a few minutes. So learning this broad range is very important. And then just trying it out. If you can, I can remember being really scared to use CBT or EMDR or other therapeutic approaches that I have. But I tried it, and the more that I used it, the more comfortable I was. So secondly, what you want to do is, of course, we want to go for evidence-based practice, right? And evidence-based practice is one about the clinician's abilities, their skill set, all the time that you've learned to use a particular approach. The more that you do it, the better you are, which I already mentioned, right? That's one part of evidence-based practice. The part that everybody thinks about with evidence-based practice is the research. So looking at research, and not just looking at the stuff that works. You really want to look at everything. Sometimes it doesn't work. That doesn't mean it won't work for you. Sometimes a population is not a good fit for a particular therapy, or that therapy needs to be adjusted. Okay? And then the third perspective or element of evidence-based practice is the unique characteristics of the individual. So if we're doing, for instance, EMDR, where we want to use bilateral stimulation that's based on rapid eye movement, that sleep phase that helps you to process things and address the disturbance, the emotional disturbance that's been attached to memories. When people have been traumatized, it's not necessarily so effective, that rapid eye movement sleep cycle. And so sometimes we have to do more in order to be able to address that emotional disturbance, particularly when it piles up. The more traumas a person has had, the bigger that emotional disturbance is, the more likely they are to be easily overwhelmed. So we know from looking at both Van der Kolk and Rothschild that people hold trauma not just in their mind. They don't just have an image or a thought, but they have emotions and sensations that are also a big part of what needs to be processed. If we're using, for instance, cognitive behavior therapy, well, that might be a problem if somebody's emotionally overwhelmed. Being able to access their cognitions won't be so easy. So sometimes we need to start with the emotions, and then we can go back to the cognitions, because those emotions and cognitions are connected to each other and result in the person's behavior. But sometimes CBT isn't the best approach to take because the person just isn't in a place to talk about those emotions. So maybe we need to use something like emotional freedom or DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, or EMDR. And again, we need to look at what that person is ready for. So you can't always use the therapy all the time. You have to, it's kind of like doing a dance with somebody. You might jump in and you might dance right a little bit. You might do a fast dance. Then you might do a slow dance. Then you might sit down because you're tired and you can't dance anymore for a little while. Then you go back to doing the fast dance. Does that make sense? So people, when they're working on their trauma, can only handle so much. And you, as the practitioner, regardless of what kind of therapy you're using, you have to be able to determine what a person can handle. Okay? I'll give you an example. This is a pretty extreme example. So with any kind of therapy, with any person at all, there are certain things that we always must do. We need to show who we are as a therapist and help the person make a decision about whether or not you're the right therapist. So I say to people from the very beginning, you might not feel comfortable with me, and that's fine. What's important is that you tell me that so that we can find you another therapist who would be a better fit for you. It's not a personal thing. I haven't failed as a therapist. It's just that there's something about me that just isn't a good, the person doesn't feel comfortable. Okay? We need to build up a relationship with the person, a therapeutic relationship that mirrors what we hope the person will be able to do once they're in the therapy and after they finish the therapy. So communication style is important, how you communicate to the person, how you hold your body language, what you say, how you say it. All of that is you are role modeling for the person. You're using your emotional intelligence. You're using your skills of nonviolent communication. All of those things, finding common ground. These are all approaches that we can use with people. And that when we do that, we are helping them see how this happens. One of the best things we can do is to check in with somebody. You just told me something that it looked like it was pretty hard for you to say. How did I handle it? What was my response? Because we want people to be able to read other people. But we also want to confirm the fact that you told me about your story and I wasn't shocked and appalled. And I wasn't blaming you for your story. So how am I handling that? Because if the person can recognize that I can handle their story, then they're likely to tell me more of their story. I've had people tell me, I'm never going to tell you my story. I'm sick of telling the story. I've told it to so many people. I've been in therapy a million times. I'm still having issues. And I only actually am here. I had one person say, I'm only actually here because my doctor said I had to be if I wanted the medication. So what I say is fine. I'll start with where you want to talk about. And each week the person talked about things that, that were personal, relationship issues, abuse in a relationship, not talking about their previous history. So we would speak about, well, what does this mean? How is it affecting you? How do you feel about it? What can you do about it? And then I would say, I recognize that you don't want to talk about what happened in previous trauma, but I'm wondering if this is reflective of the situation you were in your previous trauma. And the person did eventually tell me some of their story. But we didn't dwell on that because they didn't want to be there. And it doesn't matter because whatever is happening in the present is often a reflection of those past experiences. And if we work on those present things, all roads lead back to the trauma. So we build trust, and we work on acceptance. We are open, but not so open that that the person then feels as though they need to take care of us. So I'll tell you a story. There was a young man who I went to work with. He had autism, and he was essentially nonverbal. He could say some words, but not whole sentences. And I wasn't sure how I was going to work with him because he wasn't a guy who could talk to me. So we had to establish a relationship. And we did that using two techniques. One, we watched The Price is Right, which he loved to watch every day. And I spoke to him about the emotions that he was watching people have. Could he recognize those emotions? Did he have those emotions? And so we worked on that. We worked on using a flyer from the newspaper, the Sunday paper, for a grocery store, talking about what food he liked and what food he didn't like. So I could establish a reliable yes and no, so that when I asked him other questions, he could tell me yes and no reliably, that I could accept his no. And in the beginning, the best that I could do was sit on the floor with him. So I'm from Philadelphia. You can see I have my Eagles shirt on today because it's the Eagles game. But I'm really a big Phillies fan, and he was a big Phillies fan too. So I could talk pretty knowledgeably about the players and what was happening with the Phillies. And so that's where we connected, and that's what you have to do. His unique characteristics were autism and his love of the Phillies. And so that's where we started. Then one day, staff said to me, there are times when he is pretty aggressive, pretty physically, hurts himself, hits his head on the wall, on the floor, tries to hurt other people. And that usually happens in the afternoon. And I said, well, I think maybe I need to come and see him in the afternoon. And so I did. And we did what we usually did. Now, before we got there, sorry, to the afternoon part, I forgot an important part. Before we got there, we worked on building a certain range of strategies. We got a weighted blanket, which really was pretty effective, and we shared the weighted blanket. So I'd sit on the floor, I'd put the weighted blanket partly on me and partly on him so he could get used to it. I would sit pretty close to him. We worked on things like if he became really upset, one option would be instead of hitting people, he could bang on the floor. He could, we talked about when he was upset, keeping his eyes open, because when you close your eyes, you dissociate more. And I had staff there to learn about this so that they could use this with him during the times when he was upset. The one thing that I said, we had a whole list. We called it his bucket list. Oh, we talked about things that he loved. I forget. Everything started with a B, but I don't remember a couple of them right now. A list of like food places that he liked to go, and that was pretty calming to him. Or all the sports teams that he liked. And he could name each one. Like he could say certain words or parts of certain words, but he couldn't explain anything more than that. So I did eventually go to meet with him one day in the afternoon, and we were doing pretty well. About 1 o'clock, I met with him. About 1:30, his eyes glazed over, and he looked really distant and was disconnected. And he got really quiet. He had a ball that he bounced on. That was another one of the techniques that we used. And he stopped bouncing on the ball. And all of a sudden, he started taking his hands and smashing his hands against his head and banging his head on the floor. And he tried reaching out to hit, And so I backed up. Staff came. By that time, I had convinced them not to restrain him. They had restrained him, which only made it worse. And I told them not to do that. And then they said, okay, you're right. We shouldn't have done that. Um, so they got beanbag chairs, and they kind of nestled him with the beanbag chairs all around him. So he had kind of a secure space. And he would bang his head on the floor. I mean, it was pretty hard to watch. It was really aggressive toward himself. And so he did this for quite a while, maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then he stopped doing it, and he started wailing and crying, big tears coming down his face. And so I sat down on the floor with him and got right up. He had his knees up, and I got right up next to him. And I mean, I'm going to tell you, I was pretty scared. He was a really big guy, and he could have headbutt me, and I would have had a concussion for sure. But seemed to me to be in a place where I could sit with him. And we put the weighted blanket on, and I started using, so I'm an EMDR therapist, and I started using bilateral stimulation, one knee and then his other knee, and I just started tapping on his knees while he was wailing and crying. That was also really hard to watch. And then after another 10 or 15 minutes, he stopped, and he would kind of his eyes, I could tell by his eyes that he was looking at me, and sometimes he was off in the distance, and then he would look at me and then off in the distance. The whole thing took about 45 minutes. And then he was back to being who he was before it all started. So I went every week, and we worked every week on that. And in just a few weeks, it took 10 minutes. He wasn't aggressive. They tried to put a helmet on him so he couldn't hurt his head. But then they got the idea that maybe they could use a baseball cap. And so the baseball cap reminded him not to hit his head. The brim in the front made it hard, right, to smash his head down. And so he stopped doing that. The beanbag chairs worked. The weighted blanket worked. We worked on smashing the floor instead of hurting people. We would, in the moment, work on him keeping his eyes open. So he would, and talk to him about where he was. You're in your house, look around, you see the TV, you see the couch, you see me, you see the staff. We would try to ground him in the present. And pretty soon, he didn't do it anymore. That wasn't that he wasn't aggressive anymore. He was still sometimes when he was upset about things, because that was a strategy that he had learned and that he had used over and over again. Okay, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm going to stop the video for a second, and then